Well, thank you very much. I am in Portland, Oregon, which is on the United States West Coast. And the reason you see me wearing a fleece is that outside it's about 7 or 8 degrees. And this is typical weather for Oregon. So I understand it's very hot where you are, and I wish I were sharing your tropical weather. Anyway, this morning, what I would like to do is to give you an overview of what I believe are the opportunities and challenges in healthcare, but particularly with the application of blockchain and healthcare. So this is not for you really advanced program developers. It's not about UI design. It is more about the general trends in blockchain and healthcare. And for some reason, I can't control the.
Is it okay? Let me check that.
Okay.
Can you? Is it
okay? All right. So let's first start off with a definition of blockchain. Many people, when they hear blockchain, think of blockchain as Bitcoin, they think of it as Ethereum. Blockchain is not cryptocurrency. Here we're talking about a technology of distributed ledger systems for databases. And that isn't working either. So if you can do me a favor, when you hear my computer click, if you can forward the slides.
I'll do that.
Okay. It is absolutely safe in that it prevents corruption or physical disruption. And that's why cybersecurity is such a big investment area for companies and venture capitalists today. And it is relatively inexpensive when you look at setting up a system of database management, distributed database management, and the use of smart contracts. It's efficient because peer-to-peer data can be exchanged at the rate of email. And now we start off with the crux of tonight's presentation, or this morning's presentation, why blockchain in healthcare. If we look at the objective of medical science, it is only as good as it is properly applied to patients who need it. Blockchain can redistribute healthcare knowledge and expertise where and when needed, and this is very, very important with privacy and protection. Now we have to ask, is this going to happen in our lifetime? I found this cover from a magazine. Oops, if you can go back. Go back one slide, yes. I found this cover from a magazine called Science and Invention in 1925. And there it was probably more the imagination of a science fiction writer than it was of a technology or a scientist. And there they're showing the basic concept in 1925, almost 100 years ago, of the concept that we now call telehealth, telemedicine. If we look at healthcare and ICT connectivity, you can see that there are many, many islands with the patient traditionally at the center of the healthcare system, but hospitals, specialized and smaller nursing facilities, physical therapy, the compounding pharmacists, home and healthcare, urgent care. But you can see that there are many, many different islands that all have to be connected through information and communications technology. The telehealth building blocks you can see here are the telehealth systems, which is basically databases. And the fundamental piece of information in that database is the electronic medical record for patients. But we're talking about applications, we're talking about the infrastructure equipment, we're talking about links and telecom safety. But why telehealth? And many analysts were talking about why telehealth would take time to implement, partly because of the physician shortage, partly because of the distribution of technology expertise as well as medical expertise, aging populations in most countries, cost savings that were required, and I'll share a little bit about my project work in places like Croatia and Russia later in this presentation. Patients who've tried it like it, but the reason that it really started to take off over the last few years was because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Many patients were afraid to go to hospitals if they had non-COVID conditions. Many physicians were worried about treating people in the emergency room if they were coming in for pulmonary problems, diabetic problems, and possibly COVID-19. Now, if we look at the overall telehealth objectives, we have to transform the business model. We have to change patient behavior as well. And this was several years ago, but when I was attending as a presenter a program in Vietnam and in Singapore, the National University of Singapore was working on telehealth for stroke patients. And the reason for that is that many stroke patients would go to their rehabilitation appointments, physically go to their appointments with the help of a friend or a family member. But after a few months, guess what? The friend, the neighbor, or the family member simply couldn't take leave from his or her job. And what happened was that there was a 50 to 70% drop-off rate in stroke patients going to their rehabilitation programs. And so we have to talk about changing patient behavior. But the Singapore National University then started using more telehealth in order to encourage the rehabilitation process digitally and virtually. Focus should be on health versus illness, and they should lower the cost of chronic disease. In a few minutes, we'll talk about the India example. But for example, chronic disease is a major issue of healthcare in India. India, even today, has the largest number of diabetes cases per 1,000 or per 100,000 in the population. And of course, there's a lot of COPD, pulmonary disease as well, because of the bad air quality in the major cities. Improve patient satisfaction. And this is not only about the cost of healthcare, but also the effectiveness of treatment, which means that treatment has to be based on correct diagnosis, and then that leads to better treatment. Here, we're talking about the focus on patient care, again, on health versus treating illness after the symptoms arise. Mobile health is very important. And with the cost of telecommunications coming down, with the cost of servers coming down, this is becoming more and more widespread in many countries. Patient education, of course, is very important. People who are older feel that part of healthcare delivery is actually a face-to-face visit with the physician. So this is going to call for a lot of patient education as users and as they feel more comfortable with user interfaces. Remote patient monitoring is also important, and I'll discuss this in a few minutes about some of the very unique ways that are being developed today and will probably become quite widespread over the next 5 to 10 years. Outsourced specialty services is something that is gaining traction. In the United States, probably the most famous outsourcing of specialty services is the diagnosis of X-rays. They go to specialist centers, maybe in 3 or 4 cities in the United States, and the radiologists and the radiology technicians will actually diagnose the X-ray so that not every hospital, not every clinic in the United States has to have these specialized services or service providers. Now, lessons from India. 1.4 billion people. the most populated country in the world, okay? However, the issue in terms of healthcare delivery distribution is that 70% of India's population live in villages. And the reason this is a big issue is that 90% of secondary and tertiary care facilities are in cities and towns. So you have 70% of the population that is not served by 90% of the medical expertise because of the distribution of the population. Again, to summarize, inadequate medical facilities in the villages. Acute shortage of specialist doctors. And based on what my partners in India did a couple of years ago before the pandemic, 75% of medical specialists live in only 6 cities across India. So again, a huge, I wouldn't say misallocation, but a huge imbalance of where the medical specialty knowledge is compared to where people in India live. Now, currently, because of the national government's ability to apply unique identity numbers, and this was a major effort because the average citizen had several numbers for kerosene allocation, food allocation, tax registrations, and there were many numbers for each individual. But there are currently almost 1 billion unique identity numbers issued to each individual. And telemedicine has been launched on a B2B basis and a B2C basis. So India is probably the most advanced country in the world in terms of unifying patient, or I shouldn't say even patient, but it is used as a patient identity number, but the most advanced country in terms of creating these identity numbers.
So Doug, I'll also tell you about this unique identity that you mentioned. So
Yes.
It's called Aadhaar. And so the government is now also exploring, putting all these records on blockchain. So we can have the citizen identity system on the blockchain.
Yes, yes. No, that's very important. And we'll talk about some of the challenges around that. But if we look at healthcare expenditures as a percentage of gross domestic product, most developed countries stay around 10%, and they do that deliberately in order to provide enough funding for other services, for economic growth, for job training, for education. Germany is at 10%, Japan is at 10%, but the USA is at 20%. And for people who will listen, the economic forecast is a continuation of 20% of gross domestic product on healthcare is not sustainable. This will bankrupt the United States of America in another 15 or 20 years. India, again, because of the imbalance of where medical expertise is and where the population lives, is very, very low at 3%. And for a population of 1.4 billion, this is low. If you look at populations like Vietnam, 5%, Cambodia, 5%. And people say, well, why is it so low in a country like Vietnam where you have 90 million people? The reason is the average age in Vietnam is 24 or 25. So the population is young. They don't experience the same number of health issues that you find in advanced and aging countries like Japan or Germany. But this is just to show you the disparity of how much is spent on healthcare in developed countries and in India. Now, one of the things that's really helping with blockchain is the implementation of artificial intelligence and all the AI algorithms. It has resulted in a significant reduction of time to diagnose. Up until a few years ago, what happened was that one specialist who wasn't sure because the probability of his diagnosis being correct might have been 40%. So he or she would consult other specialists and they would say the probability is 49%, but if it was a severe case, for example, stage 4 cancer, they would choose the highest probability as opposed to the more correct one. But with artificial intelligence and with DNA testing, now the time to diagnose is reduced and the probability of a successful or a correct diagnosis has gone up significantly. Also, artificial intelligence and telemedicine means access to global expert databases, so that a specialist in Mumbai can now consult all of his fellow specialists across India, and if he wants, can look into the NHS database in the UK or another database in a country that has a very, very similar pattern of disease. And it reduces the volume of counterfeit drugs. In some of my previous project engagements, we found, especially in Africa, where malaria is still a prevalent disease, counterfeit anti-malaria pills account for 60% of the pills that are sold, simply because there's a lot of money for the counterfeiters, and it's easy to counterfeit a malaria pill with color and dye. Now, what's available today are all these health monitors. And I said earlier that I would talk about what these are being used for. I am working with a group of virtual reality experts. They're mostly technologists, but what they've done is they've used telemedicine, but they've also put their rehabilitation for stroke patients into a virtual reality film. What this means is that the patient can see a digital twin of himself or herself, and because they have these monitors, the physical therapist, who could be half the world away, is watching the patient and can actually monitor the patient. If the patient is supposed to move her arm 75 degrees, the monitor that you see here can say that the right muscles are being exercised, but the patient is only moving her arm 60 degrees. And the physical therapist can then encourage the patient, please move your arm a little bit higher because we have to exercise that flexor muscle. And if we look at other tools that are available, primarily from Fitbit, a lot from Apple, and a lot from other companies that are applying medical sensors now, smart scales, otoscopes to measure heartbeat or to measure other sounds, blood pressure monitors, digital thermometers, glucose readers. So all of these tools are being applied, and they're all part of what will be the blockchain mechanism in healthcare. We have other things like robotics. Here we show a robot following a physician assistant or a nurse, but there is robotic remote surgery in its early stage, but it's being applied more and more, but again, in big cities, not in smaller towns or not in villages. And there's live monitoring via cell phones. The barriers, though, and most people don't think about this, IoT is device interoperability. The venture capitalists think this is a huge area to make money, because with IoT, they're talking about trillions of digital transactions a day. Because I've spent time in cybersecurity, if there is no device interoperability, that means 1 trillion opportunities for cyber criminals to invade the medical device, steal the information, or corrupt the information. As one example, and I'm sure several governments have thought about this, if the prime minister from one country has to go in for minor surgery, the president of an enemy country can order his cybersecurity service to disable or to disorganize the data for that minor surgery in the enemy country, and then say, take out his left lung or take out her kidney. So they can really disrupt that. And I sincerely believe that this capability exists today, but countries will not do that because it would unleash probably a major real-time war that we have like in Ukraine and Russia today. So when people talk about the future of IoT, they tend to ignore the cybersecurity issues and the data corruption or the data theft. Inertia of the status quo. Several years ago, I was asked to be an advisor to a blockchain in telehealth company. And the chief technology officer was a young immigrant from Vietnam who was the chief technology officer at Stanford Medical School. I asked him, I said, you had one of the most prestigious jobs in the world. Why did you leave? And he said, because Stanford University's chief legal officer paid him a visit and said, because you are an officer of Stanford, any intellectual property you develop belongs to Stanford. And he had a lot of good ideas. So he said, I'm resigning. I'm starting my own company. Well, what he told me was that even though Stanford is supposed to be one of the leaders in pioneer technologies, the deans there were 2 years away from retirement. They did not want to have to work 20 hours a day again, working on a major transformation to vet new technologies, to set up training programs for the new technologies, and to totally transform the nature of medical education at their university. So it's the inertia of the status quo. Very smart people who don't want to work so hard anymore. The next is vested interests. In many countries, a lot of medical practitioners are making a very good living doing what they do. And for them to invest in new technologies, new training, will decrease their earning power. But more than vested interests, when I was doing some project work in healthcare in Croatia, which is part of the old Yugoslavia, there was a very unique webinar. Well, it was actually a live audience with the past health minister of Croatia, the present health minister, who only had 2 more months because of an election, and the future health minister. And I told them, I asked them a question. I said, you know, if you shut down 50% of your village hospitals, you could save 50% of your limited healthcare budget. The future healthcare minister said, if I do that, the children of the 80-year-old woman who's in one of these small villages lives in our capital city in Zagreb. They will vote my political party out of office, and I will have a limited term as healthcare minister, and I will never have a chance to become prime minister of my country. So we're talking about not only vested interests where the cash is, but as you know, healthcare is a very political issue. Implementation costs. I said earlier that blockchain is very inexpensive, but it does require more infrastructure, more servers, more secure communications links, and of course, a lot of retraining, because blockchain will eliminate the need for a lot of procedures and processes, but it will increase the use of what we call smart contracts. So the Genesis code that's set up is going to require a lot of retraining. And so there are implementation costs. Now, we started earlier by saying, why blockchain in healthcare? Again, the definition or objective is healthcare is only as good if it's properly applied to patients who need it. Blockchain can redistribute healthcare knowledge and expertise, especially with privacy and protection. But because there is such a lack of interoperability among medical devices, and when electronic medical records are transferred from one department to another, not just from one hospital in one city to another hospital in another city, but from one department to another, you have vulnerable network connections. You have vulnerable operating systems in the medical devices. So this is why blockchain is very important, but it needs to be implemented properly. So that is really the overview I wanted to give, but thank you, or thanks to the pandemic, the implementation of blockchain in healthcare and the implementation of telemedicine has actually been accelerated. So we're looking probably at another 5 years instead of another 30 years before this becomes the dominant process in our industry. So thank you very much, Pratik, for setting up this webinar.
Thank you, Doug, for this wonderful talk. And we certainly learned a lot about blockchain in healthcare and various applications. So just a question from my end would be, you say that, so it's primarily for IoT is what you're saying, the application of blockchain in healthcare. And because the security for healthcare products is life threatening, or it can directly impact someone's life, so it becomes all the more crucial. So what is that what you're getting to?
Yes, yes. And the environment for disclosure of security breaches is improving. But until cybersecurity became a major issue, or ransomware became a major issue, many large healthcare facilities would wait before they would announce a breach because they felt it would reduce patient confidence in their hospital. They felt that especially if they were publicly traded, they would reduce the value of their overall hospital chain. But that's improving slightly, but very, very slowly. And so the issue with blockchain is that it makes cybersecurity a much safer issue. But that's only when it comes to the electronic medical record. When it comes to healthcare devices, there's still the issue of data being able to be stolen, either through the network or directly by invading the healthcare device.
Right, certainly. And one issue you mentioned is that of interoperability. And I think that is an issue with all blockchain applications, whether
Yes.
you do it in supply chain, whether you do it anywhere. So different solutions are available, and there's no consensus as to what should be the common procedure. So how do you see that getting solved in the blockchain community in general?
Well, I think it's going to take a very strong cooperative effort. And unfortunately, you have so many manufacturers of healthcare devices, so many manufacturers of different cybersecure networks. And so the last thing they want to do is to use either open source code or to make something that is interoperable, because then they lose their advantage in the marketplace by saying we're unique because we have these set of protections. I don't want to tell you how many years ago, but last century, General Motors was the largest manufacturing company in the world. And they asked me, and they asked one of the largest telecommunications companies in the world to help them design a platform called computer integrated manufacturing. And what they wanted to do was implement the concept of open source code so that all of the machines that went into manufacturing parts and assembling the parts into a car ran very, very smoothly, like an integrated beginning to end supply chain. Guess what happened? After General Motors spent several $1 million, the robotics arms manufacturers, the numerically controlled line operators all said, no, we're not going to do that, because then we look like every other product and we have no competitive advantage. So General Motors had to abandon that whole project after they spent a lot of money. And the medical device manufacturers are going through the same thing. They're saying they're spending a lot of money on product research and development and on government health approval. And they're saying after they spend all this money to build a unique medical device, why should they open their operating system or their intellectual property to other manufacturers or their competitors? Then they lose their ability to make a return on their research and development investment.
Right. So more than a technology problem, it's a business problem.
Yes, yes.
Right. Certainly.
Hey, hi, mate.
Hello.
Yeah, hello. It was a very insightful session. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that, and I learned a lot from this particular session. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
And so my question, since we were talking about electronic medical record, so
Yes.
my question is, there are two common standards that have been prevailed in across countries. Like one is high level 7, which is a standard that's been followed in order to store the electronic medical record.
Yes.
The second is fast health interoperable resources. So how do you think these two standards will comply to the blockchain blockchain technology per se. Like, because in order to store all the medical record, we need some kind of standards, right? So how do you think that will fit into the blockchain? Like, that was my curious question that I just wanted to to ask you.
No, I think the issue there is not the existence of standards. The issue is one of compliance. This has been a very frustrating experience for me because it takes so long, but I sit on the IEEE Standards Committee for Blockchain in Agriculture. And the reason I do that is because to me, the food supply chain is just as important as healthcare. But when we're looking at building the standards, what we find is that the ideas for those standards differ by where the committee member comes from. So the Chinese idea of what the standard should look like looks different from what the idea of the committee member from Germany looks like. So first, it takes a long time to develop a standard that becomes a global standard. But once that standard is agreed on and becomes part of publication from the IEEE, what we found is the issue is one of compliance. And most people in the healthcare industry, healthcare devices, hospitals, insurance companies will comply with it. But there'll be some rogues that find out that they can gain more money if they don't always comply with those standards. So to me, it's really an issue of compliance more than the existence of the standards themselves.
Yes, I guess, yeah, that would be a valid point as well, that we need to consider that as well. And I could also see that there are some companies like Pokidoc or Scalamera and some other companies who are already working on blockchain for healthcare, but they're all using proprietary solution, like in order to store all the medical records. So again, after compliance, again, interoperability would be the third concern, I would say, right?
Yes. And what's interesting is I was very, very fortunate. Many years ago, someone from the Netherlands asked me to join his board of advisors. And this was a very small spinoff of Citibank Technologies and before blockchain. But based on his experience in building huge cybersecure systems for banks, he went back to his home country. He became the head of strategy and innovation at Philips. And during his 10 years at Philips, he transformed Philips from basically a light bulb company to a medical device company. Jeroen Tas is world famous for that, but he wouldn't talk to me for a while when I said, Jeroen, you have done great things for Philips. You've done great things for people around the world with healthcare innovations. But I said, nobody on your team is working on the vulnerability of IoT devices. Because what we showed when I worked with a bunch of white hats was that they could, with an iPhone standing maybe 10 meters away from the medical device, they could steal all that device from something that was picking up vital signs for a patient. And then, of course, they could use the iPhone to then transmit that data to their own, what I would call, criminal server. So there were all these problems. And if you look at IoT, and if it comes to 1 trillion transactions a day, most of the telecommunications companies have said that without a further extension of edge computing, there is no way the networks can handle that safely. They have to offload to unsecure lines, which means that the ransomware criminals can easily pick off vital healthcare information before it goes into the electronic medical record. So there are just so many ways for ingress and egress of individual healthcare data. That's why blockchain is so important. But the whole idea is that it will take time to implement.
Yes, got it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Doug, very much for your time. So, just as a closing thought, can you also tell us, as you're the advisor at My Cena, that particular project, what you're doing over there in blockchain and healthcare?
Okay. All right. Well, that's great. Again, thank you, everyone. I've really enjoyed this, and I encourage you to continue to expand the boundaries and the future of blockchain in healthcare. But healthcare is just so very important, especially with the population now approaching or soon to approach 10 billion people. The two issues of food security and healthcare security are very, very important issues for all of mankind.
Sure. Thank you very much, Doug, for your time and for the talk. It was a pleasure.
Okay, Pratik. Yes, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your hot weather.
Indeed.
Okay, all right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So much.
Okay, thank you, Pratik. I really appreciate this. Okay,
Yes, we'll release this on our social channel and we'll let you know. I will tell
okay,
you when.
great. All right. Stay in touch. Thank you again. Take care. All right. Bye.